I'm Brianna Johnson, 52 years old, and 6 months ago, I thought I had seen it all after 3 decades in the tech industry. But what happened when my white trainee got the promotion? I was promised shattered every illusion I had left about meritocracy. But what happened next taught me something even more important about the power of documentation and the courage it takes to demand what you've earned. If you've ever felt invisible despite your qualifications, please let me know where you're watching from and subscribe to join others who understand this experience. 28 years ago, I walked into Data Tech Solutions as a bright-eyed 24-year-old with a computer science degree from Howard University and dreams bigger than the cramped cubicle they assigned me. The company was expanding rapidly, riding the wave of the internet boom, and they needed talented developers who could keep up with the breakneck pace of innovation. I was drawn to data tech because of their stated commitment to diversity and their reputation for promoting from within. During my interview, the hiring manager, a kind-faced white woman named Patricia Hendricks, told me they were looking for people who could grow with the company. She painted a picture of unlimited potential, of a place where hard work and talent would speak for themselves. I remember walking out of that building, feeling like I had found my professional home. Those first few years were intoxicating. I threw myself into every project with the kind of intensity that only comes from believing you're building something meaningful. I stayed late debugging code, while my colleagues headed home to their families. I volunteered for the challenging assignments that others avoided, the ones that required working with difficult clients or learning new programming languages on weekends. My manager, David Chen, seemed to appreciate my dedication. He would stop by my desk to discuss complex technical problems, treating me like a valued team member rather than just another junior developer. When I successfully led the migration of our entire customer database to a new system, saving the company hundreds of thousands of dollars, David made sure I got recognition at the quarterly all-hands meeting. For the first time in my career, I felt like my intelligence and hard work were being seen and valued. The golden period came during my 5th through 8th years at DataTech. I had been promoted twice, first to senior developer and then to team lead, and I was managing a group of 6 programmers working on our flagship product. My team consistently delivered projects ahead of schedule and under budget. I had developed a reputation throughout the company as someone who could solve impossible problems and mentor struggling developers back to productivity. The smell of fresh coffee and the gentle hum of dozens of computers became the backdrop to some of the most satisfying work of my life. I would arrive each morning at 7:30, an hour before most people, and spend that quiet time reviewing code and planning the day ahead. My office overlooked the parking lot, and I remember feeling a sense of pride watching the cars fill up, knowing that I was helping to build something that mattered. The future felt limitless. Patricia, who had become the VP of engineering, would often mention me in leadership meetings as an example of DataTech's successful diversity initiatives. I was invited to speak at university career fairs, representing the company to potential recruits. I had started thinking about the next level, about becoming a director and eventually a VP myself. But looking back now, I can see the hairline cracks that were forming in that perfect picture. There was the time during a client presentation when the CEO introduced my entire team, but somehow forgot to mention that I was the lead architect of the system we were demonstrating. I brushed it off, telling myself he was just nervous and didn't mean anything by it. There was the pattern of my ideas being met with skepticism until a male colleague would repeat them, suddenly making them sound brilliant and worth pursuing. I noticed that I was often the only person of color in leadership meetings, despite DataTech's workforce being almost 30% Black and Latino. When I brought up the lack of diversity in senior positions during a company retreat, Patricia nodded thoughtfully and promised to look into it, but nothing ever changed. The feedback on my performance reviews was always excellent, but somehow the timeline for my next promotion kept getting pushed back. They said they were restructuring, or waiting for the right opportunity, or wanted me to get more experience with budget management first. I developed a habit of working twice as hard as my white male peers, staying later, producing more, leading more successful projects, as if perfect performance could shield me from whatever invisible forces seemed to be holding me back. The day everything became clear started like any other Tuesday morning in March. I had arrived early as usual, settling into my ergonomic chair with my first cup of coffee, reviewing the agenda for my 10 a.m. meeting with Patricia. For 6 months, we had been discussing my promotion to Director of Engineering, a role that would put me in charge of 3 teams and make me the highest-ranking Black executive in the company's history. The position had been created specifically for me, Patricia had said, to recognize my contributions and prepare me for even greater leadership responsibilities. I had been doing the work of a director for over a year, managing budgets, interfacing with clients, and representing the engineering team in C-suite meetings. The promotion was supposed to be a formality, the natural next step in a career trajectory that had been building for nearly a decade. I'm Brianna Johnson, and today I need to tell you about the moment I learned the difference between being valued and being valuable. 6 months ago, I walked into what I thought would be a routine promotion meeting and discovered that everything I believed about meritocracy, fairness, and my place in corporate America was built on quicksand. The white trainee I had personally mentored for 18 months had just been handed the director position that had been promised to me. But before you think this is just another story about workplace disappointment, let me tell you what I did next, because it changed not just my life, but the entire culture of my company. My story with Data Tech Solutions began when I was 24 years old, walking through their gleaming lobby for the first time with a computer science degree from Howard University tucked under my arm and a heart full of hope. The company recruited heavily from HBCUs in those days, part of what they called their commitment to bringing diverse perspectives to the tech industry. I was drawn to their reputation for innovation and their promise that talent, not connections, would determine how far you could climb. During my final interview, Patricia Hendricks, the VP of Engineering, told me that Data Tech was building the future of software development, and they needed brilliant minds like mine to make it happen. She spoke about the company's core values of excellence, integrity, and inclusion, with the kind of passion that made me believe I had found not just a job, but a mission. My childhood had prepared me for this moment in ways I didn't fully understand at the time. Growing up in Atlanta during the 80s and 90s, my parents, both college-educated professionals, had raised me with what they called the talk, not just about navigating interactions with police, but about succeeding in predominantly white spaces. My father, a civil engineer, would tell me stories about being the only black face in conference rooms, about having to be twice as prepared and 3 times as patient as his white colleagues. My mother, a high school principal, taught me that excellence was not optional, that I would be judged not just as an individual but as a representative of my entire race. They sent me to a private school where I was often one of only 3 or 4 black students in my class, not because they wanted to separate me from my community, but because they wanted me to be comfortable navigating spaces where I might be the only one who looked like me. By the time I reached Data Tech, I had perfected what I thought of as my professional persona: articulate, non-threatening, always prepared, never giving anyone a reason to question my competence or commitment. Those early years at Data Tech felt like validation of everything my parents had taught me. I attacked every assignment with laser focus, volunteering for the complex debugging projects that made other developers groan, staying late to master new programming languages, and building relationships across departments. My manager, David Chen, seemed genuinely impressed by my technical skills and work ethic. When I successfully led the migration of our customer database, a project that required coordinating with 6 different teams and managing a timeline that had no room for error, David made sure I received company-wide recognition. I remember standing in front of 300 employees during the quarterly meeting, receiving applause for saving Data Tech nearly $1 million in system downtime costs. For the first time in my professional life, I felt like my intelligence and dedication were being seen and valued for what they truly were. The golden years at Data Tech spanned from my 5th year through my 8th year with the company. I had been promoted to senior developer and then to team lead, managing a group of 6 programmers who consistently delivered our most challenging projects. My team became known throughout the company as the group you called when the impossible needed to happen. We launched the 3rd version of Data Tech's flagship product 6 weeks ahead of schedule, implemented a machine learning system that increased processing efficiency by 40%, and maintained a client satisfaction rating that was 12 points higher than the company average. I had developed a mentoring style that combined technical expertise with emotional intelligence, helping struggling developers find their confidence while pushing high performers to exceed their own expectations. My office had become an informal gathering place where junior developers would stop by for career advice and where senior colleagues would bounce ideas off me before major presentations. Patricia began including me in strategic planning sessions, asking for my input on everything from hiring priorities to technology investments. I felt like I was being groomed for something bigger, and the future seemed to stretch ahead of me like an open highway. But there were warning signs that I either missed or chose to ignore. During client presentations, I noticed that while my technical explanations were always praised afterward, the initial introductions somehow never seemed to highlight my role as the architect of whatever system we were demonstrating. When I would propose a new approach or technology during team meetings, the response was often lukewarm until a male colleague would echo the same idea, suddenly making it worth serious consideration. I began to notice that I was frequently the only person of color in leadership meetings, despite Datatech's workforce being nearly 30% Black and Latino. The company's diversity statistics looked impressive on paper, but when I looked around the conference table during executive briefings, I saw a sea of white faces staring back at me. When I raised concerns about advancement opportunities for developers of color during a company retreat, Patricia nodded thoughtfully and promised to look into mentorship programs and unconscious bias training, but months would pass without any visible changes. The feedback on my performance reviews was consistently excellent. I was rated as exceeds expectations in every category, but somehow my timeline for promotion to director kept getting postponed. There was always a reason: budget restructuring, organizational changes, the need for me to gain more experience with vendor management or client relations. I found myself working longer hours, producing more documentation, leading more successful projects, as if perfect performance could somehow insulate me from whatever invisible currents seemed to be slowing my advancement. I watched white male colleagues with less experience and fewer achievements move into senior roles while I was told to be patient, that my time would come. I developed what I now recognize as hypervigilance in meetings, carefully monitoring facial expressions and body language for signs of dismissal or bias, exhausting myself trying to decode subtext and navigate unspoken rules that no one had bothered to explain. The conversation that changed everything happened on a Tuesday morning in March. I had arrived at the office at 7:15, as was my habit, using the quiet morning hours to prepare for what I expected to be a routine promotion meeting with Patricia. For 6 months, we had been discussing my advancement to Director of Engineering, a role that would put me in charge of 3 teams and make me the first Black executive at Datatech's leadership level. The position seemed tailor-made for my skills and experience. I had been performing director-level responsibilities for over a year, managing budgets that exceeded $2 million, representing the engineering team in board presentations, and serving as the primary technical liaison for our 3 largest clients. Patricia had told me the promotion was a matter of when, not if, and that she was just waiting for the appropriate organizational moment to make the announcement. I knocked on Patricia's office door at exactly 10 a.m., carrying a portfolio of my recent achievements and a mental list of goals I wanted to accomplish in my new role. Patricia gestured for me to sit down, but something in her expression made my stomach tighten with an anxiety I couldn't name. "Brianna," she began, her voice carrying a careful tone I had never heard before, "I want to thank you for all the incredible work you've been doing. Your contributions to this company have been absolutely invaluable." The word invaluable hung in the air between us, and I felt the first flutter of panic as I recognized the setup for bad news. She continued, "As you know, we've been restructuring the engineering department to better align with our strategic goals, and we've decided to move in a different direction with the director position." My hands went cold as she explained that they had decided to promote James Mitchell, the 28-year-old white developer I had been mentoring for the past 18 months, to the director role. James, who had joined the company as a junior developer straight out of college with no prior industry experience. James, who had come to me countless times for guidance on everything from technical architecture to client communication. James, who had openly credited me with teaching him everything he knew about leadership and project management. James has shown remarkable growth and potential, Patricia was saying, and we think he brings a fresh perspective that will help us innovate in new directions. Of course, we still see you as absolutely crucial to the team's success, and we're hoping you'll continue in your current role, maybe with some additional responsibilities, to help support James as he transitions into leadership. The room seemed to tilt slightly as I processed what I was hearing. I had trained my replacement, and he was being promoted over me to the position I had been promised. The irony was so sharp it felt like a physical pain in my chest. I managed to keep my voice steady as I asked, "What specific qualifications does James have that made him a better fit for this role?" Patricia's answer was a masterclass in corporate doublespeak, phrases about leadership potential and strategic thinking and cultural fit that said everything and nothing at once. When I pressed for specifics about my own qualifications and performance, she assured me that I was absolutely excellent at what I did, but they needed someone who could think more broadly about organizational challenges. The meeting ended with Patricia asking me to help train James for his new responsibilities, to share my institutional knowledge and client relationships to ensure a smooth transition. I walked back to my office on unsteady legs, my mind racing through everything that had just happened. I sat down at my desk and stared at my computer screen without seeing it, trying to process the magnitude of what had just occurred. The promotion I had been working toward for 6 months, the role I had essentially been performing without the title or compensation, had been given to someone I had personally trained. Someone whose qualifications were a fraction of mine, whose experience was measured in months rather than decades, whose knowledge of our systems and clients came directly from sitting in my office asking questions. I felt a familiar weight settling on my shoulders, the same heaviness I had carried as the only Black student in advanced classes, the only Black developer in leadership meetings, the only Black candidate being considered for executive roles that somehow never materialized. That evening, I called my sister Maya, a civil rights attorney in Washington, D.C., and tried to explain what had happened without breaking down completely. "Brianna," she said after I finished recounting the meeting, "you know what this is, right? You see the pattern here." I did see it, but part of me was still trying to rationalize Patricia's decision, still looking for explanations that didn't involve race. Maybe James really did have some quality I was missing. Maybe there were strategic considerations I didn't understand. Maybe this was just bad timing, and another opportunity would come along soon. Maya listened patiently to my attempts at rationalization before asking me a question that cut through all my self-doubt. "If you were white and male with your exact qualifications and track record, do you think they would have promoted James over you?" The answer hit me like cold water. Over the next few days, I began to notice things I had trained myself to overlook. The way conversations would shift slightly when I entered a room, becoming more formal and careful. The pattern of my suggestions being met with polite interest until a white colleague would reframe the same idea, and suddenly it would gain traction. The fact that in my 8 years at Data Tech, I had never seen a Black person promoted beyond team lead level, despite the company's public commitments to diversity and inclusion. I started paying attention to meeting dynamics with new eyes, noticing how often I was interrupted or how my expertise was questioned in ways that my white male colleagues never seemed to be. I realized that I had been performing an exhausting daily balancing act, being assertive enough to be taken seriously, but not so assertive that I would be labeled as difficult or aggressive. The breaking point came 3 weeks later during a team meeting where James was presenting the new departmental strategy. As I listened to him outline plans that were nearly identical to proposals I had made months earlier, I felt something shift inside me. He was presenting my ideas, using my research, implementing changes I had recommended, and receiving praise for his innovative thinking and strategic vision. When Patricia complimented him on his fresh approach to team management, something inside me snapped. I raised my hand and asked, "James, can you tell us where you got the inspiration for this restructuring plan?" The room went quiet as James stumbled through an answer that carefully avoided crediting me directly while not quite claiming full ownership either. Patricia quickly moved the meeting along, but I saw several colleagues exchange glances that told me I wasn't the only one who had noticed the similarities to my previous presentations. That night, I made a decision that would change the trajectory of my career and ultimately transform Data Tech's entire approach to diversity and promotion. I was going to document everything, gather evidence, and demand the accountability that the company's own policies promised but never delivered. I was going to show them exactly what my qualifications were worth, and I was going to make sure that no other person of color at Data Tech would have to watch their white trainee get promoted over them ever again. I was 52 years old. I had given nearly 3 decades of my life to building expertise and reputation in this industry, and I was done being patient. The first thing I did was request my complete personnel file from HR, citing my right under company policy to review all documentation related to my employment. When the thick folder arrived on my desk 3 days later, I spread the contents across my conference table and began building a timeline of my career at Data Tech. What I found was even more damaging than I had expected. My performance reviews were consistently excellent, not a single rating below exceeds expectations in 8 years. My salary increases had been minimal compared to industry standards, and when I cross-referenced them with publicly available data about Data Tech's compensation structure, I discovered that I was being paid nearly 20% less than the market rate for someone with my experience and responsibilities. Most tellingly, there were multiple emails in the file where Patricia and other executives discussed my readiness for promotion, always concluding that I needed more time or experience, despite objective metrics that showed I was outperforming every other team lead in the company. I began reaching out to current and former Data Tech employees, particularly other people of color who had left the company or had been passed over for advancement, what I discovered was a consistent pattern stretching back over a decade. Talented employees of color would be hired with great fanfare, celebrated as examples of data tech's commitment to diversity, given meaningful work and positive feedback, but somehow their careers would stall at the senior level. They would be told they needed more experience, more seasoning, more strategic thinking, while white colleagues with fewer qualifications moved into leadership roles. Several former employees told me they had been asked to train their white replacements before leaving, just as I had been asked to train James. The pattern was so consistent it felt like a playbook. I also began documenting current incidents with a level of detail I had never bothered with before. When my suggestions were dismissed in meetings only to be adopted when restated by white colleagues, I noted the date, time, attendees, and specific language used. When I was excluded from strategic planning sessions, despite being responsible for implementing the resulting decisions, I documented who was invited and who was not. When clients specifically requested to work with me but were told that other team members would be handling their accounts, I recorded those conversations. Within 6 weeks, I had compiled a portfolio of evidence that painted a clear picture of systemic bias in how talent was recognized, how credit was assigned, and how advancement opportunities were distributed. The breakthrough came when I connected with Cheryl Washington, a former data tech marketing director who had left the company 2 years earlier. Cheryl had been passed over for a VP position that went to a white male colleague with less experience, and she had filed a complaint with the EEOC before ultimately deciding to leave for a better opportunity elsewhere. Her case had been settled quietly, with data tech agreeing to policy changes that were never actually implemented. More importantly, Cheryl had kept detailed records of her own experiences and was willing to provide them as supporting evidence for what she called a pattern of discriminatory behavior that goes way beyond individual incidents. Armed with documentation, spanning nearly a decade, I requested a meeting with Patricia and David Chen, the company's CEO, to discuss what I now understood was not a single unfair decision, but a systematic problem with how data tech evaluated and promoted talent. I spent hours preparing for this conversation, anticipating every possible defense they might offer and gathering data to counter each one. I knew they would say that promotion decisions were based on merit, so I prepared comparative analyses showing that my performance metrics exceeded those of every white colleague who had been promoted above me. I knew they would claim that James brought unique qualifications to the director role, so I created a detailed comparison of our respective experience, education, and achievements. I knew they would suggest that I might be more suited to other types of roles, so I documented my successful performance in every aspect of leadership they claimed to value. The meeting was scheduled for a Friday afternoon in the large conference room adjacent to the CEO's office. I arrived with a presentation folder containing 43 pages of documentation, organized chronologically and cross-referenced by type of incident. Patricia and David were already seated when I entered, along with Sarah Martinez, the head of HR, whose presence suggested they were taking this more seriously than I had expected. I had rehearsed my opening statement dozens of times, but when the moment came, I found myself speaking from a place of calm clarity that surprised even me. I'm here today because I believe data tech has a systemic problem with how it evaluates and promotes employees of color. I began, and I have documentation spanning 9 years that demonstrates this pattern clearly. 6 weeks ago, I was passed over for a promotion to Director of Engineering in favor of James Mitchell, a white male colleague whom I personally trained and who has significantly fewer qualifications for the role. Today, I want to show you exactly what my qualifications are worth, and I want to understand how data tech plans to address the broader pattern this decision represents. I opened my presentation folder and began methodically walking them through the evidence I had compiled. I showed them my performance reviews compared to those of colleagues who had been promoted above me. I presented data on salary disparities between employees of color and white employees in comparable roles. I documented specific instances where my ideas had been dismissed only to be implemented when suggested by white colleagues. I shared testimonials from former employees who had experienced similar treatment. For 45 minutes, I presented a case that was so thoroughly documented and clearly articulated that no reasonable person could dismiss it as coincidence or misunderstanding. The room was absolutely silent when I finished. Patricia was staring at the documents spread across the conference table, occasionally picking up a page to examine it more closely. David was taking notes on a legal pad, his expression unreadable. Sarah was reviewing what appeared to be company policy documents, probably checking Data Tech's official procedures against the reality I had just presented. Finally, David cleared his throat and said, "Brianna, this is a lot to process. The documentation you've put together is very thorough, and some of the patterns you've identified are deeply concerning. I think we need to take some time to review everything you've shared and have a broader conversation about how we can address these issues systematically." Patricia looked up from the documents and said, "I want to be clear that nothing you've shown us today changes my opinion of your value to this company. You are an exceptional employee and leader, and I regret that our processes haven't reflected that appropriately. I think we need to have a serious conversation about how to move forward in a way that addresses both your individual situation and the broader concerns you've raised." It wasn't an admission of wrongdoing, but it was acknowledgement that my concerns were legitimate and required action. Over the next 2 weeks, I had a series of follow-up meetings with David, Patricia, and Data Tech's outside employment attorney. They asked detailed questions about specific incidents, requested additional documentation, and began conducting their own internal review of promotion patterns and compensation disparities. I learned that my conversation had prompted them to engage an external consulting firm to conduct a comprehensive audit of their hiring, promotion, and compensation practices. More immediately, they offered me the Director of Engineering position with a salary adjustment that brought my compensation in line with industry standards and included back pay to account for years of being underpaid. But I told them the position alone wasn't enough. If they were serious about addressing systemic problems, I wanted to see comprehensive changes that would prevent other employees from experiencing what I had been through. I wanted transparent promotion criteria, regular bias training for all managers, diverse hiring panels for leadership positions, and clear accountability measures for executives whose departments showed persistent diversity problems. I wanted mentorship programs that actually supported employees of color rather than just identifying them as potential recruits for white colleagues to train and replace. Most importantly, I wanted a commitment to measuring progress with the same rigor they applied to financial metrics, with regular reporting and consequences for failure to meet diversity goals. 3 months later, Data Tech announced the most comprehensive diversity and inclusion initiative in the company's history. They implemented blind resume reviews for all senior positions, required diverse interview panels, and established clear timelines and criteria for promotion decisions. They created a mentorship program specifically designed to support employees of color in developing leadership skills and building internal networks. They began conducting annual pay equity audits, with adjustments for any disparities identified. Perhaps most significantly, they tied executive compensation to diversity metrics, making it financially costly for leaders to maintain the status quo. The changes weren't just policy updates, they were cultural shifts that rippled through every aspect of how Data Tech operated. Within 6 months, they had promoted 3 people of color to director-level positions and hired their first Black vice president. The mentorship program I had helped design was supporting 15 employees of color in developing leadership capabilities. Exit interview data showed that retention rates for employees of color had improved dramatically, and employee satisfaction surveys indicated higher levels of trust in the company's commitment to fairness and inclusion. My own role evolved in ways I hadn't anticipated. In addition to my responsibilities as Director of Engineering, I became an internal consultant on diversity and inclusion issues, helping other departments identify and address their own patterns of bias. I was invited to speak at industry conferences about systemic approaches to workplace equity, sharing Data Tech's transformation as a model for other companies struggling with similar challenges. I discovered that my experience at Data Tech was far from unique. Countless other professionals of color had similar stories of being passed over, undervalued, and asked to train their white replacements. But I also learned that change was possible when companies were willing to examine their practices honestly and commit to meaningful reform. The personal transformation was just as significant as the professional one. I had spent decades trying to be the perfect employee, working twice as hard as my white colleagues, and accepting inequitable treatment as the price of admission to corporate success. Speaking up about the discrimination I experienced required me to risk everything I had built, but it also freed me from the exhausting performance of trying to make myself small enough to fit into spaces that weren't designed for people like me. I learned that my value wasn't determined by other people's willingness to recognize it, and that demanding fair treatment wasn't asking for special consideration. It was insisting on basic professional respect. The ripple effects extended beyond Data Tech's walls. Other employees of color in the tech industry began reaching out to me for advice on documenting discrimination and advocating for change in their own companies. I started speaking at universities, helping prepare young professionals of color for the challenges they might face and the strategies they could use to overcome them. I became involved with professional organizations focused on supporting Black women in technology, sharing resources, and building networks that could provide the kind of support I had to create for myself. Today, when I walk through Datatech's offices, I see a different company than the one I joined 29 years ago. The leadership team looks different, with faces that reflect the diversity of our workforce and our client base. The culture feels different too, more open to different perspectives, more willing to examine its own blind spots, more committed to living up to its stated values. It's not perfect, and the work of building a truly equitable workplace is ongoing, but it's a place where talent is more likely to be recognized regardless of what the person looks like or where they come from. I'm still at Datatech, now as Senior Director of Engineering and Innovation, leading a team of 42 developers and architects who are building the next generation of our core products. But my relationship with the company has fundamentally changed. I'm no longer grateful just to be included. I'm a valued leader whose expertise is sought and whose perspective is respected. I no longer perform the exhausting dance of trying to prove my worth every day. My track record speaks for itself, and the systems are in place to ensure that recognition and advancement are based on merit rather than bias. The most important lesson I've learned is that silence in the face of discrimination isn't just harmful to the person experiencing it. It's complicit in perpetuating systems that hold everyone back. When I accepted being passed over for promotions, underpaid compared to my peers, and excluded from opportunities I had earned, I wasn't just hurting myself. I was allowing a culture to persist that would inevitably harm other talented people who deserved better. Finding the courage to speak up wasn't just about getting what I deserved. It was about changing systems that were failing everyone. If you're watching this and you recognize your own experiences in my story, I want you to know that you have more power than you think. Document everything. Every instance of bias, every time your ideas are dismissed only to be adopted when suggested by someone else, every conversation where you're told you need more experience, while less qualified colleagues are promoted around you. Build your case methodically and present it professionally, but don't wait for the perfect moment or hope that being patient will eventually pay off. The systems that perpetuate inequality won't change themselves. They require people with courage to demand better. For my white allies who are watching, your support matters more than you know, but it has to go beyond private conversations and social media posts. When you see bias happening in meetings, speak up in the moment. When you're in hiring or promotion discussions, ask hard questions about why qualified candidates of color are being passed over. Use your privilege and platform to amplify voices that might otherwise be ignored. Real allyship requires taking risks and having uncomfortable conversations, not just expressing good intentions. If you're in a leadership position, understand that diversity and inclusion aren't HR problems. They're business imperatives that require the same level of attention and accountability you give to financial metrics. Conduct regular audits of your hiring, promotion, and compensation practices. Implement transparent processes that reduce the impact of unconscious bias. Tie executive compensation to diversity goals so that progress becomes a business priority rather than a nice-to-have initiative. The work of building equitable workplaces is ongoing and requires sustained commitment from everyone, but change is possible when people are willing to examine their practices honestly and commit to doing better. My story at Datatech isn't unique. It's one example of what can happen when organizations are challenged to live up to their stated values, and when individuals find the courage to demand the respect and recognition they deserve. I'm Brianna Johnson, I'm 52 years old, and I'm proof that it's never too late to stand up for what you're worth. The white trainee who got my promotion taught me that talent without advocacy is often invisible, but talent combined with courage and documentation can transform entire organizations. If you've made it this far in my story, I hope you'll subscribe and share it with others who need to hear that their worth isn't determined by other people's limitations, and that speaking truth to power isn't just the right thing to do. It's the only way real change happens.